Venerable Sumedha made a very important point, and actually I think that might actually explain why the Buddha takes this sequence of the 6 sixes as far as craving and stops there. Because the reason, what underlies the identification with everything that comes earlier as self, the sense faculties, the objects, the consciousness, and so on. What underlies this identification with self is the craving to own this body and mind and to use it as the instrument for continued experience. This is why the Buddha calls craving bono bhavika, the craving that leads on to repeated existence. And so through craving, we hold to this body and mind, these 5 aggregates, or these 6 sense faculties. We hold to them, we identify with them, and take them to be self. Then when death takes place, the craving is still there. And through that craving, then we grasp a new type of existence and undergo rebirth or renewed becoming. And so what underlies the whole process of repeated existence or samsara is craving. And the reason why, or the way in which craving holds to this body and mind is by identifying them as this is mine, this am I, this is myself. And so when the Buddha takes the sequence as far as craving and shows first that each of the earlier things is not self, then with each demonstration, the I is not self, forms are not self, then craving has to give up its hold on those things because they're no longer myself. It's just like the Buddha says, they are like the trees and jatas grow. We don't say, those are myself, but the trees, the branches, the foliage, it's not mine, not I. So now with this demonstration that the sense bases, sense objects are not self, when we see that they're not self, then craving doesn't hold on to them. But craving still remains sort of absorbed within, at the deepest level, absorbed in itself. This we could call, maybe using a Freudian term, primary narcissism. Primary narcissism, the love of craving for itself. And so now the Buddha sort of, in order to drive craving out from that hiding place, he demonstrates that craving itself is anatta. Craving is not self. Then when one sees that craving arises and passes away, then there's nothing that can be held on to. And even the craving falls away from that absorption with itself.
So you would say that Descartes' statement is Marxism, because we start with raga tamna, asmimana, ahankara, cogito ergo sum.
Okay, so this same basic method of argument continues as far as the mind objects, mind consciousness, born of mind contact, and Dhamma tanha, the craving for mental objects. Okay, basically the whole sutta, that part of the whole sutta is all repetition. Okay, now when you read, then you can read and reflect upon how the argument will apply to each of these, but there's nothing more for me to say. Okay, now we come to paragraph 16, where the Buddha is now going to introduce a new sort of approach to this situation. And he now is demonstrating the way leading to the origination of personality. But the word translated personality here is Sakkaya, which maybe is better translated, now I use the translation, identity, because personality tends to suggest my character. Like we say, this person has a cheerful personality, this one has an aggressive personality, this one has a gloomy personality, but that's not the sense intended by this word Sakkaya. Sakkaya means rather what we identify with, what we take our identity to consist in. And so the word Sakkaya means the 5 aggregates subject to clinging. The Pali word here is Sakkaya. Okay, so what our personal identity consists in, according to the Buddha's teaching, are the 5 aggregates of clinging, the Panchupadana Khandha. Though one might also explain it, but I don't think the text, the suttas ever use this explanation, but one could also explain it in terms of these 6 sixes. These also make up personal identity. These 6 sixes are actually the same as the 5 aggregates, but from a different angle. Okay, now the Buddha is going to show the way leading to the origination of identity. How it is that these 5 aggregates come into being from one existence to the next. And the way they come into being, according to this passage, is through the identification with these 6 sixes. Through identification with them and appropriation of them. That is, taking any of these 6 sixes to be mine, that is appropriation, making it our property. And the other way is by identification, taking it to be I or myself. So, beginning with the I, one regards the I thus. This is mine, this I am, this is myself. One regards forms thus, eye consciousness thus, eye contact thus, feeling born of eye contact thus, and the craving for forms thus. One regards, this is mine, this I am, this is myself. This way of regarding these objects, this is Sakkaya Ditthi, what's called personality view or identity view. In other words, it is the view which identifies any kind of object in the body or mind as being a self or the property of the self. And the commentary explains that this short passage here shows the first 2 noble truths. Of the 4 noble truths, we have 2 noble truths here. The first noble truth is the noble truth of dukkha, of suffering. That noble truth consists of any of the 6 sixes themselves. Because everything within the 5 aggregates, within the body and mind, that is the noble truth of suffering. And this way of regarding the different elements of the 6 sixes, this identification view or identity view, This here is the way leading to the origin of personality. In other words, this is the second noble truth, the truth of the origin of suffering. Okay, then the next passage shows how there comes the cessation of identity. In other words, the ending of the round of rebirths, the cutting off of this continuity of existence after existence. And that is called here, it's the way leading to the cessation of identity. And that is the particular path of practice. One regards any of the sixes as being not mine, not I, not myself. The text just fills this out for all 36 items. So here we have, by this regarding the sixes as being not self, here we have the development of what's called anatta sanya, the perception of non-self through the development of insight. And one arrives at this insight into the selfless nature of the sixes through attending to the impermanence, to their impermanence. When one discerns the arising and passing away of eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, and so on, then one sees that the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind are not mine, not myself. And according to the commentary, this little passage here represents the third and fourth noble truths. The third noble truth is what? Cessation of suffering. So that means the cessation of the sixes. And the fourth noble truth is what? The way to the cessation of suffering. Usually the Buddha explains it as the complete Noble Eightfold Path, but here he's really just compressed the whole path into this way of insight contemplation based on the characteristic of not-self. Okay, with this passage on the origin and cessation of identity, in a way that is a complete teaching in itself, because it shows the way to liberation just through this development of the insight into selflessness. But now the Buddha takes another approach to the same issue. Again, he's going to show how we have bondage and suffering through certain defilements, and how we come to liberation through the abandoning of these defilements. But now the Buddha uses a different framework. He takes the framework of what is called in Pali the anusayas. This word means the latent tendencies or underlying tendencies. And it seems that the reason why this sutta includes two different presentations of the same thing is because the Buddha sometimes uses or shows the origination of suffering through two different sequences which have a different emphasis. From one angle, we could look at the origination of suffering through what we can call cognitive distortion or mental error. In this sequence, we begin with avijja, ignorance. Ignorance leads to wrong views, distorted views, and from these distorted views, we have bondage and suffering. The other sequence takes it from a more emotional angle. Here we take the root of bondage to be tanha, craving. This craving turns into clinging or grasping, attachment, and then through that attachment, suffering arises. So it seems in the first sequence here in this sutta, which emphasizes from paragraph 16 to 27, the Buddha is developing the sequence through ignorance, wrong views, and suffering. And now, though ignorance is mentioned in this passage on the underlying tendencies, but the particular approach or angle is that where craving is dominant, and craving leads to clinging, and clinging leads to suffering. Okay, so now the Buddha is showing how the underlying tendencies originate. Here, dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. The meeting of the three is contact. With contact as condition, there arises a feeling which may be pleasant, painful, or neutral. Okay, now when there is a pleasant feeling, then one delights in it, welcomes it, and holds to it. In that case, the underlying tendency to lust, raganusaya, lies behind this, lies behind it. That is because one has lust, craving for pleasant feeling. So this underlying tendency towards lust, this is always dormant in the mind. But when we meet with pleasant experiences, then that tendency becomes activated and we hold to, cling to the pleasant experience. When one experiences a painful feeling, then one becomes upset, one experiences sorrow, one undergoes grief, lamentation, and at the extreme end, one weeps, beating one's breast. Why me? Why me? Ayo. And then one goes out of one's mind. You see this at funerals. Okay, when this happens, then what underlies it is the tendency to patigha, aversion, dislike, repugnance. One rebels against one's circumstances. What is that? Dvesha. It's very similar to Dvesha, to dosa. It's really just another term for dosa. Okay, so in this case, it's the underlying tendency to aversion which is activated. Okay, then when one experiences a neutral feeling, something neither pleasant nor painful, then one does not understand how it arises, how it passes away. One doesn't understand its gratification, the danger in it, and the escape from it. All of that is not understanding, that is ignorance. And so in relation to this neutral feeling, the underlying tendency of ignorance lies dormant and becomes activated. Okay, then once the Buddha, all of this, the text is so evident that it really needs no explanation. Then the Buddha says, that one shall hear and or painful feeling and the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to the neutral feelings, without abandoning those underlying tendencies, without abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge, it is impossible to make an end of suffering. Okay, then the same thing is developed for all of the other bases. Okay, so here we have again the first two noble truths. But here the noble truth of suffering, that is represented just by the word suffering itself. When the Buddha says that one will make an end of suffering, their suffering is just represented by itself. And the cause or origin of suffering is specified as the three underlying tendencies: lust, aversion, and ignorance or delusion. Okay, then comes the opposite side, the positive side, the abandoning of the underlying tendencies. Again, it's the same sequence. The I informs up through feeling. I see one experiences a feeling felt as pleasant, painful, or neutral. Okay, when one is touched by a pleasant feeling, if one does not delight in it, does not welcome it, does not hold to it, then one is overcoming the underlying tendency to lust. Okay, now the Buddha is showing a kind of freedom from this emotional bondage. When one is touched by the painful feeling, if one doesn't become afflicted with sorrow, grief, and lamentation, then the underlying tendency to aversion does not lie within. When one is touched by a neutral feeling, if one understands its origin and passing away, the gratification, danger, and escape in regard to that feeling, then the underlying tendency to ignorance does not lie within. Here, the way I would understand this passage to be rather compressed, since in the early stages, one will undergo pleasant, painful, neutral experience, and the tendencies are still present. But what one has to do is restrain these tendencies from becoming active. Then, as one restrains them through right reflection, through wise attention, through mental discipline, then one develops more and more the ability to withstand the storms of desire, aversion, and the mists of ignorance. And when one dispels the storms of desire and aversion, dispels the mist of ignorance, then one comes to this clarity of mind on the basis of which one develops insight. And it is through the development of insight, vipassana or prajna or wisdom, that one uproots the underlying tendencies so that they are cut off at the root and no longer remain within. Okay, so then the Buddha now is speaking with reference to the case of one who has totally eliminated the underlying tendencies. That is the Arahant. He says that one shall here and now make an end of suffering by abandoning the underlying tendency to lust or pleasant feeling, by abolishing the underlying tendency to aversion or painful feeling, by extirpating the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neutral feeling, by abandoning ignorance and arousing true knowledge. This is possible. And so on for the other bases. And here we have the third and fourth noble truths. The third noble truth, the truth of the cessation of suffering, that is shown by the expression, one shall here and now make an end of suffering. And the way to the cessation of suffering, that is shown by abandoning the underlying tendencies. Okay, then the Buddha, after explaining all of this, now he goes back, in a sense he turns the teaching back, since with the passage that just ended, he's described the disciple who's made an end of suffering. But now he goes back to a disciple who's still on the path, and he says, seeing thus, the well-taught noble disciple becomes disenchanted with the eye, disenchanted with forms, disenchanted with eye consciousness, disenchanted with eye contact, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with craving. Okay, so on with all the other bases. Being disenchanted, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, his mind is liberated. When it is liberated, there comes the knowledge. It is liberated, and he understands birth is destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, there is no more coming back to any state of being. Okay, then the ending here, it's very important. When the Buddha finished speaking, the bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words, and while this discourse was being spoken, through not clinging, the minds of 60 bhikkhus were liberated from the taints. Then the commentary doesn't remain satisfied with this, but the commentary says that when many of the great Mahateras like Venerable Sariputta, Mahamoggallana, and so on, they also gave discourses based on the sutta, and each time they gave discourses, then 60 monks were liberated from the taints. Then even after the Dhamma came to Sri Lanka, when Arahant Mahinda gave sermons based on this discourse, then the minds of 60 monks were liberated by the taints. And there was one famous monk, I read the passage last week, the elder named Malayadeva, he, who was living in Sri Lanka, he taught the sutta in 60 places, and each time he taught it, 60 bhikkhus attained arahantship. But there's one who even surpassed him. This was the Tripitaka master named Chula Naga. It said he taught this sutta to a vast assembly of human beings and devas, and at the end of the discourse, 1,000 bhikkhus attained arahantship, and amongst the devas who were present, only one remained a worldling. Now, when Bhikkhu Bodhi taught the discourse at the Buddhist Publication Society in Kandy, Sri Lanka, how many bhikkhus attained arahantship? How many householders entered the paths and fruits?
We are sitting here, we are not sitting there, otherwise maybe we would have a chat.
Anyway, we keep on trying. Okay, any comments?
Comment, only an illustration.
Yeah.
Maybe the word anusya, and art is something where you are not repeating what you see, it is make visible what you don't see. And anusya we can't see, but we make it visible by imagining a sleeping city. If you have gone on a hill and you see a sleeping city, you see a sleeping city, it is a very fine picture to imagine the anusyas. And suppose they have some antennas, and when there is a happening outside, then it rings the bell, and those concomitants are creeping up. So it's always good to have a picture of things which we don't know by our vision. Make it, and then we know anusaya, the sleeping tendency, the sleeping city. That's the only little illustration for a word.
So maybe I could fill in the illustration of the city even more. Okay, there's in every city, at least every big city in America, there's a certain section called the pleasure district. This is like in New York City, it's Times Square, where you have the movie theaters, dance halls, theaters, other forms of pleasurable entertainment. Okay, so during the daytime, that part of the city is pretty much asleep. I mean, there are people walking back and forth, but nothing really is going on. But when darkness falls, then all of the theaters will turn on their lights, then the music halls start, and you get different types of music. The dance halls start, and people start pouring in for the dancing, and all the entertainment takes place. That is like the raga anusaya becomes activated. And the other parts of the city are known as rather dangerous areas where people from the outside don't go into these parts of the city. We call them, they're the slums, where usually there are gangs hanging around, gangs of youngsters, drug addicts, criminals. And so if no outsider is going by, then the dangerous section is pretty quiet. But if, say, members of one gang trespass on the territory of members of another gang, then the guns come out, the shooting starts, and killing and mayhem starts. Then in certain parts of the city, these are like the quiet residential areas where people live quite comfortably. They get up in the morning. This violent part of the city, the dangerous part, that is like the patika anusaya, the tendency to aversion, which as long as there is no painful feeling, then it's quiet. But when one has some unpleasant experience, then it pulls out the guns and starts shooting, or else it becomes upset and starts weeping. Then the abhijja anusaya, the latent tendency to ignorance, that is like this quiet residential area. People get up in the morning, go to work, come back in the evening, eat their supper, watch television, drink some beers or wine, get drowsy, then fall asleep, and do this day after day without ever thinking anything about what is the reason, what is the meaning of life, why are we going through this, is there any kind of higher happiness in life? But they're just content with their day-to-day routine. That is the latent tendency to ignorance.
There are also the data bank that is maybe then used municipality, right? Municipality.
Yeah.
Where the city is organized.
Yeah.
That is probably the center of ignorance.
Yeah, maybe so. Okay, any questions? Actually, that's right, yeah. It's actually another thing for the unwholesome roots. Lust is the same as lobha, greed. Patika is the same as dosa, hatred. And avijja is the same as moha, delusion. Just the Buddha uses different terms, maybe just to show different aspects of the same state. Okay, are there any more questions? Okay, next time we will take the last sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya. That is sutta number 152. development of the faculty.